minutes, so I assume we can actually now start with our speaker today, this very great seminar that we're going to have today. And I want to thank Professor Kara Kokelman for joining us. She was really, really very kind. Let me tell you just a few facts about Kara. First of all, Kara is the current North American Regional Science Council President. I'm very pleased that, sorry, there is somebody that, can you just mute all the microphones because I could hear somebody talking. Right. Okay. So as I was saying, Kara is the current North American Regional Science Council President, which makes me very happy because a few years ago, I was president of NARS, not that many years ago, 3 years ago or so. And I did notice that there haven't been very many female NARSC presidents. So, you know, I'm always happy when we finally start getting a little bit more female in this position. So, you know, great to see such a great talent like Kara also being a NARSC president. Kara has an endowed chair at the University of Austin, Texas, and she is Dewitt C. Greer Centennial Professor in Transportation Engineering, and she studied civil engineering at the University of California, Berkeley, where she also got an MS and a PhD in 1998. If you actually want to be impressed, just have a look at Kara's Google Scholar. She has well over 18,000 citations, an H index of 59, and an I-10 index of 186, which gives you an idea of how successful she has been over the years. Her top articles, which was published in 1997 in Transportation Research Part D, has 3,670 citations, which is a massive amount of citation. So anyway, just to give you an idea of you know, what kind of speakers we have today and how great and successful she is, on top of being a very nice person, which I also appreciate. So today she's going to talk about self-driving and all-electric evidence from the US markets. And Kara, the floor is yours. Thank you very much for joining us.
Grazie mille, Alessandra. Yeah, I'm so delighted, and it's so kind of you to have a 2-hour window. I'm not sure we're going to need all 2 hours, but I certainly have a lot of slides for you today. And you can see here at the bottom of this slide are the many students that have worked on pieces of this. So we're going to talk today about 5 different papers that we have. Several of them deal with, you know, autonomous vehicles, and several of them deal with electric vehicles. Several of them deal with the entire United States simulations, and others are focused on Austin or Texas and the Texas megaregion, which is Houston, Dallas, and Austin. So you see here some pictures of some rather well-known, I guess, self-driving vehicles. And of course, over here, we've got the City Mobile, which has been in many cities, hopefully in yours, in Europe, for almost a decade now. It's a slow-moving vehicle, but it does hold many people, which is kind of nice. So they keep it in the pedestrian zones. And it's just, you know, a pretty nice way to introduce a lot of people to a vehicle that has its own driving capability. Here in the US, we have, you know, a lot of Teslas that are sort of level 2 self-driving. You want to have level 4 self-driving so that you never really have to touch the wheel. There's hopefully no wheel in the vehicle, in fact, and no pedals. And so you just kind of tell it where you're going. And if you want to stop mid-route, you can also ask it, request that it deviate from the original plan and that kind of thing. And then, of course, you've got the Google or Waymo vehicle. This is the Koala. They work with different manufacturers. They have all sorts of partnerships for that. But I've been in one of these. This is a Prius. I also have a Prius at home. And this is a LiDAR on top of it. And LiDAR is pretty expensive, so the Tesla models don't use it. But we do think for nighttime and foggy conditions and rain, LiDAR is pretty important, and the prices are falling, fortunately. So that it's more and more likely. So the first part, because you guys are regional scientists, all of these topics relate to location in space. And the first part is trucking, which is a common area for regional scientists, is trade flow. So I thought you guys might enjoy this. And this is, what's going to happen once you make travel kind of easier for freight across the nation in the trucking domain. And so rail is going to be a little bit worried about that. Trains are not very autonomous yet in the United States. And even if they are, same with trucks, you're probably going to still have an operator on board because there's the pickup and the delivery. And if something happens en route, like a tire blows out or a car hits you, you want somebody on board. This is a very expensive asset. So you're probably going to have an operator, but he or she's going to be sleeping, doing administrative work, and then helping with pickups and drop-offs and that kind of thing. So we start with the best data that we can. We have the freight analysis framework data set from the every 5-year economic census that the US does, and probably Europe does something similar. We only have 132 big zones there. So we have to break that up into counties, which are, just over 3,000 for the continental US. So I'm not including Hawaii or Puerto Rico or Alaska here, just the continental US, but we of course are exporting and importing for movements to other countries and of course those other US states. And so this commodity flow survey takes place in the economic survey for a select group of businesses. And we ask them, I guess, to sample maybe 10 of their last month's freight trips, and where their goods were going to, basically. So somebody was buying their goods from them. And this gets scaled up by the federal government to look like trade flows across the nation's 132 zones in the continental US. And we use a tool that's very familiar to a lot of regional scientists and economists, so IMPLAN for those industry to industry transaction tables, as well as the regional purchase coefficients. That's pretty helpful. This is a bit dated, so we've been playing with these data for a while, and we don't always have the latest IMPLAN. I don't subscribe. I have to borrow those from my city planning colleagues, but it's very helpful. And we also get our network data for these two networks. There's also, of course, oil pipelines that are moving gas and oil. And, there's Airline. And so there are other ways. There's maritime and the rivers through the US. So there are other ways that freight can move in this country, but the data are not as good and they're not as common for movement. So we're not paying attention to them here. We aggregated into about 13 major economic sectors. And of course, then we also have government and households as other sectors for acquisition of these products, as well as provision of labor and other inputs from government. And we use a nested logit. So this is an econometric model, and it's a 3-level nested logit because we have 2 types of trucks now. We have the autonomous trucks and we have the human-driven truck. So H is for human here. It's not for hybrid and autonomous. And so the autonomous trucks, they cost more to acquire, but they save a lot of, I guess, cost on the road because those truck drivers can stay on the vehicle and sleep. And so maybe they don't get paid for some of that, or they get paid at a lower rate overall, but the vehicle keeps moving because there are hours of service limitations for safety reasons on trucks in Europe too, of course. And we want really good commercial drivers, so they have special licenses. But the A trucks will probably be held to a lower standard, and certainly they'll be able to travel much longer distances. So if you decide to invest in that, you're probably going to use it a fair bit more because the cost per mile is going to fall because that operator is able to do other things for your company besides hold the wheel and try not to crash, which is the main activity of most drivers, including you and me, when we're behind the wheel. You've got your rail here, and then you also get to pick your origin. So where are you getting your goods for production from? And like I said earlier, we're going to work at the county level. So there's about 3,100 origin choices for your inputs, and not every business exists everywhere. So maybe some of those counties don't actually produce what you want, but if they could, they might end up locating in those counties to help get you inexpensively, through one of these 3 modes: rail, autonomous trucking, or human, conventional trucks. So this uses random utility maximization. It's a pretty old method that Dan McFadden came up with, and I was very fortunate that I was at Berkeley when Dan was there, and so he was kind of my de facto, I guess, dissertation advisor. So I had to use a special econometric specifications in my dissertation. And this one's a big workhorse for a lot of choice modeling, and it allows for unobserved heterogeneity, so variations by firm or buyer and producer. And it also allows for correlation here. There's a stronger correlation between these two modes, autonomous and human trucking, than there is with rail, for example, because of this nesting structure. And we use something called a random utility-based multi-regional input-output model. And so many of you are familiar with multi-regional, but this one allows for uncertainty and stochasticity and the nesting of those modes. And what we do is we don't have sales prices on items, but we assume that they are based on standard kind of input prices of labor, for example, or concrete or certain materials, plus all these travel expenses. So what happens in this flow chart is that we're embedding these travel costs basically into the price of the commodity to acquire it from different origin zones I to get it to your destination zone J in industry M. Okay, or commodity type M by each of those 13 industries. And then we also have the other two, the government and household industries, you could call them, outside of that. And so we're just doing weighted averages of where you're getting your inputs from and using those to kind of see how the different counties can compete with one another across the nation, and cycling through and loading the network too. There's also, you can have congestion effects, not in a big network like this where the vehicles are often driving at night and that kind of thing. But if you were to apply this at a local level for, within a day's worth of travel, you get some congestion, and you can have that feedback too into the travel times that are impacting the cost, in addition to the distance cost. So there's fuel, which is about 30% or 40% of trucking's cost actually comes from the fuel. And so they're always sensitive to that. And of course, the asset itself is depreciating as you use it. So those trucks are quite expensive. And then we have a bunch of outputs from running this. I'll show you what the shipment values and the ton miles are before. And so this is sort of the base case. And you can see over distances, and these are all in miles. I'm afraid for some crazy reason, the United States is not metric, which drives me nuts. But so kudos to all of Europe and pretty much everywhere else in the world for being in kilometers. And we've got trillions of dollars here being shipped mostly by truck, as you can see. So the bars are very high, especially on the short distances, because rail always has that first mile, last mile problem. You've got to get your goods to the station, and then from the station, typically it's very unusual that a business would be located alongside a rail station. So rail's not a big mode in terms of dollar values. It's a bigger mode in terms of tons and miles. So very heavy goods are often carried by rail in this country. So automobiles, which are a high value good, but also of course coal, which is, by the way, we're retiring a lot of our coal plants, thank goodness. It's just naturally happening because of the fracking revolution. So that's cleaning up our skies and of course our carbon footprint a little bit, but we really need to do better than that, way better. So this is ton miles, and you can see trucking still dominates at the short distances, but rail has a clear advantage over those cross-country distances. So these thousands of miles, then you're traveling about half of the country, and 3,000 you're probably traveling from coast to coast in those cases. So the trucks dominate in terms of value and in the shorter distances, but rail is carrying a lot of tons on those longer distance routes. So after we add the autonomous trucks to this model, we see increases in domestic flows all over the place. So we're seeing millions of dollars all over the place increasing. And then we also have export flows. So there are there are fewer locations where you can export from. And this has all been aggregated kind of to the FAF zones, so it's not too complicated. We didn't want these spider graphs to be too complicated, but you're seeing export movements. And then you're also seeing some trade partners losing ground in terms of the millions of dollars that are flowing. But it's mostly a picture of increasing And this is just total dollars. This is not by mode here. So it's kind of interesting. And you can also take a look at truck flows versus rail flows. So not a lot of increases in rail flows, but some. So rail, because of certain connections, rail ends up, winning in a couple markets, but mostly losing. So these are decreases in rail flows. And then, like I said before, of course, the truck can fall because you've found, you're able to get your inputs from a more efficient source that may be farther from you. So a lot of the heavy increases are across here you're seeing. So Florida to the northwest. So this would be Washington State and Oregon, and here's California, of course. So some big distance increases there, but also some reductions. So it's a complicated story, right? We've got potentially millions of sources and millions of destinations, and we've got complicated input processes to create products. So a lot of dependencies across industries and, of course, across space. We zoomed in and took a look at actual cities. So these are big cities like Arizona, Phoenix, many of you have heard of, Los Angeles, of course, I think you've all heard of. And so you can see what may have happened specifically. So Sacramento, which is the capital of California, got a big bump. Washington, D.C., so this is the District of Columbia. It's not technically a state. Big increases there, whereas Miami lost out, which might be fine. I'm not sure Miamians, although the industry there may be upset, but Miamians themselves may not be too upset. Lots of reductions in those cities on the rail side. Okay, so big reductions on the rail side. So rail industry should be very worried in that sense. But most cities across the nation, we're seeing rising truck flows, both inbound and outbound. But some cities, interesting, Houston, okay. So the Detroit and Houston and Salt Lake City are more middle of the country. And Miami, of course, is out there on a peninsula of Florida where, they have terrible hurricanes and rising sea level. And so Miami's under threat in a lot of ways because of the climate crisis. All major cities seeing lowered rail flows, and San Jose and Washington, D.C., potentially big losses in outbound rail, but Washington, D.C. has big bumps in its trucking. So big shift there. So the truck ton miles overall predicted to rise about 11% with, exports constant. So exports are driving this model. I should have said that. Of course, autonomy on vehicles and other things like drones can affect global trade patterns dramatically, but we're having exports drive this model. So those are exogenous. And so given the same pattern of exports, we're expecting, we're predicting truck ton miles to rise about 11% and rail fall about 5%. And longer trucking happening, but rail's low price still keeps it quite competitive at those very long distances. And the human-driven trucks, they don't disappear, okay? They seem to be very helpful still on the shorter distance freight where you don't need, a driver doesn't have to, his sleep patterns or her sleep patterns aren't going to affect the deliveries, but for the longer distance, it does make sense to invest in the automation, which will cost you something. I forget what we assumed. We might have assumed it added like $20,000 or $50,000 to the cost of the truck. And then for the longer distance trades, the autonomy to give that driver a break is really important. So this kind of trip can take, 10 hours. And so at that point, the driver is not permitted to drive. So the autonomous trucking really, really helps make that delivery in good time. And a lot of the commodity sectors, show an increase in the trucking's flows, both export and domestic. It lowers the overall shipping costs, so the nation's ton miles rise somewhat in general. So there's kind of this multiplier effect where things are lower. So you're seeing more movement because we have a new mode. So it's making mobility or travel, easier. And we'll see that with passengers too. So we're about to start talking about those folks, you and me, right? And so here we're just looking at airports within the U.S. And so these are pretty long trips. They're over 80 kilometers or 50 miles. So most of them are still handled by car. And but for long trips, the airlines are very competitive because once you're in the air, you travel very fast. So once you get through security and, pay for your, I don't know, your lift vehicle to the airport, and you finally get up in the air, then you can go quite far. But we are expecting some big drops relative to trend on the airline revenues, as you can imagine. And here we got to work with smaller zone systems. So even more than the counties, we're lucky that the federal government or the U.S. Department of Transportation has divvied up those counties into somewhat smaller zones. Like Los Angeles isn't a very big county, so they break those up. And we also have public use microdata areas. So our census data is available at the level of individual records, but not with an address. It's from an area. And so we have a lot of these big zones around all our cities and this kind of thing to help us take a look. So this is what it looks like. And you can see by the big cities, they've really broken it up. San Francisco, LA. Here we are in Austin. So we have a few here in Austin, and that's San Antonio and Dallas, Fort Worth, and then of course, Houston. And we were lucky that our Federal Highway Administration had already hired an excellent team to try to synthesize or fake basically a bunch of long distance trips for the nation, because we don't have good data on it. We have data for regional planning within a city area, let's say. So maybe in Austin, it's 6 counties. It's 2 million people here in our planning area, whereas the city of Austin has 1 million people. And so we have a metropolitan planning organization that acquires data so that it can simulate that for the regional travel. But for across region travel and interregional and national travel, we really don't have good data. So we had to synthesize what Florida and Michigan and California were doing and then fake it for the rest of the nation. And they did that for us. It's a little bit old now. It's from 2010, but it's the best data that this country has for the long distance travel. And the model does a lot of great things. It generates tours so that people come back. They may make a stop along the way. So it might be a 3-stop tour, your origin, someplace along the way, destination, come back. And we've got different trip types. So this is standard travel demand modeling. And this is just to give you a sense for one of these trip types. This is the work employer trip type. And this is the airline mode. We took the top airline travel pairs. And so you can see a lot of people going to Atlanta because Atlanta is a hub. They don't actually stay in Atlanta. They keep going. Dallas is a hub. Houston is a hub. Miami, of course, many of you have been through these airports. These are hubs. And so they're traveling there, but then they're probably going on maybe to South America from Miami, this kind of thing. So we added that autonomous vehicle mode, right, for all these passengers. So we did it before for trucks, and now we're doing it here for passengers. And that's going to affect not just what mode they take to get to their destination, but what destinations they choose to go to. And it may affect travel party size and departure time in the year, like which month they leave in or which day of the week. It may affect all these things. But the autonomous mode is nice because you might be able to rent, even though you didn't buy your own autonomous vehicle, you're able to rent one. And then, you don't have to go through security. You can rent at the last minute a lot of times. You don't have to rent 2 weeks or a month in advance to get those tickets. And you have the car when you get to your destination so you can travel around in that location, because as you guys know, we don't have great land use patterns. We don't have good transit systems because of that. They just aren't, they're underutilized. So it's an expensive thing for Americans to have. And again, we use a nested logit because they get to choose destination and mode. And within those modes, there's this correlation, of course, between car mode and self-driving car mode. We did have to make some assumptions because, the FHWA's report was a little bit ambiguous, and it was the modeling that their team used was pretty complicated. But this is what we came up with in terms of current travel patterns. And this is for a personal business trip. We had to assume like the marginal cost of driving a car is about 17 cents a mile, because gasoline, costs like about 17 cents a mile. So once you own a car, a lot of times you're just thinking about the marginal cost of that trip. And since most Americans do own cars, this is often what they're thinking about. It's a very low cost. But they also have their value of time. And so they don't like being trapped in a metal box. And that's might be $12 per hour per person. And it depends on the person, of course. Kids don't have very high values of travel time. busy workers, busy parents can have very high travels of time, wealthy people. But this is kind of just an average. We have a lot of people in this sample though, and so there are differences in values of time. And you can see car kind of dominates until you get to the very high distances. You see, air popping up. So it's that those purple bars that are popping up and beating car on those long distances as you go across the nation. We have rail in here and it looks pretty strong, but this is a logarithmic scale, I'm afraid, for the number of tours per year that are taking a place by rail. So even though those green bars look pretty high, they're nothing compared to the blue bars. And there's bus in there. There's bus in the background. You can see bus beats rail. But again, because of the logarithmic scale, it's not necessarily a big mode for most people. And then we have the tours filed from the RSG, the original data set. So we created a model to try to mimic this. And so we're not too far off from the original data set, but our model is not as complicated as their model. Their model is, in fact, imperfectly documented. So I'm not sure anybody can mimic it precisely. And it's a little too complicated. So we were pivoting off their predictions to try to scale up correctly at the start before we started adding those autonomous vehicles. And like I said, the cars were costing about 17 cents per marginal mile traveled. And the autonomous vehicles, we made them more expensive because maybe you're renting it or you had to buy it, but it's going to cost you more to acquire that technology. But once you're in it, you don't have to drive it. So you can spend time talking to whoever's with you or other people by phone. You can sleep, presumably. So this is a level 4 type. This is a very, very self-driving car. So no steering wheel or pedals needed. And that lowers your value of time. And so you're more willing to go farther and sit through congestion that you and I would probably hate, but people who are looking at their phones often don't even have any idea what the congestion is like outside the window of the vehicle. So that's one of the problems, right? Autonomous vehicles are going to make driving easier. So we're going to see more congestion. And here's before and after predictions. And so this is just, this is before and this is after. And so you're seeing this shift away from the airline modes. We've got some round trip distances. So these are getting very long and these are in miles, of course. Car is important, but becomes more important afterwards. And if you want to look at the 2,000 or longer travel distances, you're seeing car and autonomous vehicles, but not conventional. So I should say not car, I should say air and autonomous vehicles. So human-driven cars, those conventional cars are in blue, the dark blue, and they're still quite popular in some cases. But you can see this brighter blue for the autonomous vehicles really really showing up. It's not here in the top image because this is before, and the bottom images are for after. And the right side images are to take a look at those really long trips. And you see air, of course, still nobody wants to take an autonomous vehicle trip for 6,000 miles round trip. You got to come back usually. So that would be a nightmare for many people to be in a car. You want to get in the air and you want to go fast if you're going to travel that far. But a lot of people are not going to travel that far. Instead of flying across the nation to New York, let's say, they're like, you know what, let me go closer. Let me go to, I don't know, Memphis or Las Vegas or something. And I'm going to stay on the ground for this trip. And so you're seeing the destinations and the modes impacted and autonomous vehicles taking away a lot of market from the airlines. So making those assumptions, we're seeing, a big penetration by those autonomous vehicles. So now they're about 51% of a lot of those trips, and big percent shift here especially for the over 500 mile distance. So that's like a 9-hour trip or something on the ground. So you're seeing some big jumps there, but big losses by the airlines for domestic trip making. So this is not trips to Italy. I'm not sure what will happen there. I haven't modeled it, but the airlines will lose a lot of market share. But of course, they've been gaining market share before COVID, that we overuse airlines. It's an expensive, high energy, kind of luxury mode that we've been indulging in. And so, it'd be nice to keep people on the ground maybe and fill up those cars and keep the distances shorter. So in that sense, it might be a good thing, but the highways will get more congested. And if you want to look at vehicle miles traveled per year, we're seeing, more congestion as I was talking about. So we go from about 400 billion vehicle miles traveled a year on the ground by passengers within the continental US becoming 425. So it's about a 6% increase because of these long distance trips. We're not simulating local trips right now. It's just things over 50 miles one way or over 80 kilometers one way. And, slightly bigger increases here for those long distance trips. So maybe 10% more trips on the highways, and in the airlines, again, that 47% drop is pretty consistent, whether you model it in terms of number of people or you model it in terms of distance. And here's the market shares in case you're interested. So personal vehicles, these are autonomous and they may be rented. You don't have to own them necessarily, but autonomous vehicles versus and human-driven or conventional vehicles versus other kinds of modes. These are the market shares versus distance. So pretty high mode shares for some of those longer distances. We also looked at vehicle miles traveled by state. And so Texas, New York, Florida, California, these are big states. So are Pennsylvania and Illinois. And so maybe a 9% increase there. And if you look at the smaller states like Utah, Kansas, Wyoming, they're seeing even bigger increases. So they may feel it more because a lot of people have to drive through Utah to get to, I don't know, the West Coast, if that's where they want to, vacation, let's say. And same thing with Kansas and Wyoming. Although there are some beautiful parks in Utah, in case you guys end up coming over here once COVID is under control in terms of vaccinations, you guys may want to actually take a trip to Utah and Washington State, Virginia. These are beautiful places. So long distance travel, again, very complex thing. There's a lot of levers at play. So longer trips on the ground, but not as far as if you had flown. So we're predicting just about a 10% increase from the long distance travel on the ground and, big reductions in the domestic airline ticket sales. Something else we did is we said, well, what if you have an electric vehicle to make that long distance trip? Where should those charging stations be placed? And so we have several papers on this. I'm just going to share two of them today. And this is for the long distance trips for passengers. Okay. And, we have about 45 electric vehicles, and not hybrid, but plug-in electric vehicles for every publicly available fast charging outlet. Tesla's superchargers are not public stations. They only serve Teslas. But, there are plenty that are publicly available, and the EV to fast chargers. So we don't have a lot of fast chargers, unfortunately. When I say ratio, I guess I mean per EV, but yeah, we just don't have, we have about 1/6 of those chargers are fast enough to maybe, so in the case of our Tesla, we have a Model 3, we can fill it, any Tesla, I guess, can be filled 80% of the battery capacity in 30 minutes, which is a lot longer than grabbing some gasoline or diesel from a petrol station. But it's still, a nice period of time to take a walk or get something to eat quickly at those supercharging stations. And level 3, those are those DC, so direct current fast charging stations, and they're costly. But because battery only electric vehicles can't get any petroleum, there's no gas tank at all, they are range limited. Our vehicle gets about 215 miles. And the longest range vehicles get 400, which is a big, heavy, expensive battery that you probably don't want to pay for. But there are some that are very short range as well for, staying within cities or close to fast charging stations if you can. And yeah, our Prius can go 500 miles, but our Tesla can only go 215. And a lot of petroleum cars can only go about 400 or even 300, depending on the vehicle. So everything is range constrained, but one of the problems is how long it takes to charge that vehicle or fill up that vehicle so that you can continue a long distance trip. And we came up with a new method, a mixed integer kind of solution method to place these across the US highway network. And we studied a bunch of different range vehicles. So it's called all electric range. And we had the short ranges because that's a less expensive vehicle. And then we had these long ranges, and we had everything in between. And we said, well, what if we only had money for 50 stations? Where would we put them? What if we had money for 100 or 150 or 200, 250? So we looked at all these scenarios. Where would you put those stations if you were constrained, by range on the vehicles or number of stations? And we wanted to maximize the number of long distance trips that could be completed by these battery electric vehicle owners. So we're maximizing completion. We're only looking at trips that are at least 50 miles long one way, which was similar to what the last topic was about for those long distance, autonomous vehicle choices. And we also, say a lot of Americans are buying Teslas, and a lot of Europeans are buying Teslas. It's like a flying machine. It's not like a car. It's a crazy new technology. It's amazing. It's a rocket. Okay, so it's very popular in most countries among those who want an electric vehicle, and they of course already have supercharging stations. That's part of why Tesla doesn't make a lot of money, is they're plowing it back into they are making profit, and they're plowing it into the supercharging stations to make sure that customers don't feel that anxiety. So I can go to New York in our Tesla. I can go anywhere in the nation and through Canada with our Tesla, no problem. But I will have to wait, to charge it when I get to those stations. And so we're looking also for what the nice, mix is of battery size and number of stations. And so there's a trade-off there. The stations aren't cheap, and the batteries aren't cheap. And again, we use that same database that I was just talking to you about. It's a little dated now, but again, is like the best. We were so lucky to even have it, but we probably will have to construct something new very soon here for some more research that we're doing. It's a lot of automobile trips every year that are already taking place on the ground that we had to try to maximize completion of those. And we looked at the shortest path distances between those areas. There's like 4,000 of these things, but the network is so complex. There's 4,500 of these areas or zones. So we ended up clustering them and having just 200 and a network that's going to be a lot simpler than the real US highway network. So here's those 200 points, and you can get a sense of how much travel is taking place, like between, I don't know, Austin or San Antonio and Dallas, I guess, maybe here. And we've got San Diego and Los Angeles over here on the West Coast, and San Francisco, San Jose, Sacramento, maybe Portland, Oregon, and Vancouver, Washington, or Seattle, Washington, I should say. And then, of course, New York and Philadelphia over here on the right side. Those are big markets. Miami and Orlando, maybe. So this is where a lot of the trips are taking place on the ground between these aggregated zones. And we couldn't put charging stations everywhere across a real network. So we assumed that people stayed on the major highways, and we simplified the highway network. And like almost nobody went through here where you can see these white spaces. So we just, and there really aren't major interstate highways in those white areas anyway. So in addition to representing those origins and destinations with the black points, we placed possible charging station points in these white or unfilled points, I should say, across. So all of these little circles is a potential EV charging station point. And there might be, I don't know, 1,000 of these points here, or 846, I guess. And they're no more than 60 miles apart. So this is a little tedious to have the student do, to try to spread these out. But, luckily graduate students are amazing, very, very hard workers. And so we then this reduced the size of this problem, this very non-polynomial hard problem for us. And so we placed, we also didn't use every origin or destination. We only looked at 91% of the trips because it made the number of shortest paths that we had to keep track of fall by 90%. So by losing like 10% of the trips that are happening, we lost 90% of the potential paths, which it also helped simplify that network for us. And we have, you know, a constrained maximization problem with a lot of integer decision variables, because it's where do you place the stations. We only have 50 stations or 100 stations, depending on what our budget is. Where are we going to place them? And so lots of constraints in there. And we ended up seeing that you could serve more and more trips as you had more and more charging stations, of course, and as your battery ranges got longer. So a 300-mile battery range vehicle is the top of the chart here. That's the longest range vehicle. Even if we only had money for 50 charging stations, we could serve 86% of those trips that we were studying. So probably 86% of all trips by car in the country that are over 50 miles. And if we had 100 charging stations, we could serve almost everything, okay? But if we have this smaller car, like the original Nissan Leaf was only about 60-mile range. And so, you know, we were not able to serve those kinds of customers very well. And so what's the right range to have on the vehicle? Is it the green? Is it the 150-mile? You know, a lot of people are buying those Teslas at 200 to 350. So these are the Teslas right here. But and I guess the new Chevrolet Bolt and the Nissan Leaf are both at the 200, 220 mark. And there's, you know, those are the main all electric vehicles that I know about. There are plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. So they have both a gas tank, and then those folks can always fill up a gas tank if they want. So they don't have to wait for petroleum, but it really depends on how guilty they want to feel about their carbon footprint, because most of the energy in this country is definitely lower carbon if you're pulling from the power grid. So it does definitely help to go plug in rather than fill up your gasoline tank. So just 100 stations and 200-mile range, which is kind of the standard minimum now on these all electric vehicles, are serving over 91% of our long distance car trips. They may get longer though, right? And once we start buying autonomous vehicles that are electric or something, then autonomous vehicles are going to make a lot more trips on the ground. And you do have to worry about queuing at the stations, right? Especially on holidays when a lot of people want to go on a long distance trip on the ground, and they may end up queuing at those stations. So they may need to be big stations in certain markets. If you have 200 stations and you reduce the range, so you reduce the cost of that battery, you can serve a similar number. But I am happy to report that the cost of batteries is falling faster than they actually expected. So they were seeing it kind of plateau or peter out, but it's still falling. And so they're very happy about that, because we really need battery storage to allow us to use more renewables in the mix of our feedstock. So wind and solar are very intermittent, and so we really need batteries for a lot of reasons. But it does seem that the added range on the vehicles is more helpful, but of course that's expensive to have all those millions of vehicles with those batteries versus, you know, 100 more DC fast charging stations. Looking at percent vehicle miles traveled served, so that we were talking about trip completion, but now this is just percent vehicle miles served. These are lower numbers generally. So this blue line here for the 60-mile vehicles is lower, and same here, this 78% is lower than what we saw before. But you are still getting very close to 100% for these kind of standard designs with, you know, 100 or maybe 150 charging stations. So most of that long distance mileage is being taken care of. And that was nice to see. So if we, just to give you a sense of where these stations are, here's a picture of where we placed them. So this is with 150-mile range battery only electric vehicles and charging stations at those dark spots. Okay, so they sort of look like hourglasses, I guess. There's 50 of them there. They're mostly in the eastern part of the US, where we, of course, sort of developed from. So, you know, our settlement pattern started here, moved towards Chicago, but the California corridor is big. And of course, that's where most of the Teslas have been purchased. Tesla's headquarters are in California. California is much more progressive about protecting the environment than most of the other states, but Massachusetts and Oregon and Washington and several other states actually adopt California's rules on emissions and everything. But California also has a very clean grid. This whole Western grid, very clean, mostly, I think now renewables. In Texas, I can tell you, 60% of our electricity here in Austin is non-carbon. So some of it is nuclear, and then we've got a lot of wind and solar investment here for Austin. But the Texas grid itself, I think, is about 20% renewables and maybe 10, 15% nuclear. And so it still has a long way to go in terms of getting to zero or near zero carbon sources. If you only have 100 stations, you know, you're going to be a little more sparse. It doesn't look actually more sparse. I feel like these two have been switched. Oh wait, no, that was 50 stations. Excuse me, this is twice as many stations. So 150 miles, but only 100 stations. And so we're starting to, you know, see more added to Texas and to California, for example, and more in this what's called Midwest of the nation. So this is helpful, you know, to state departments of transportation and to the federal government and maybe to cities in deciding, you know, who gets the charging station. If you're still assuming that 150-mile range, you can do the 200 station. You can do, let's see, I can't see this here. Gosh, or 368 stations. So I assume this was like 250. I'm not really sure. But yeah, we also threw in the 100 Tesla stations and said, okay, those already exist. Where's the best place to put 100 new stations? And hopefully Tesla will open up those charging stations pretty soon to others because they're amazing. Tesla is amazing at making batteries. And so it's either drawing the power from the electrical grid right there, which is a lot of power if you've got multiple people charging, or it's storing some on site, like in California and Hawaii, where electricity is quite expensive. A lot of those Tesla stations actually have a big battery on site. And so they're delivering a current from those batteries and pulling at a uniform rate from the above ground high voltage lines to keep their costs down so they don't pull too much power at once. You can look at which interstate highway. So the IH here on a lot of these columns stands for an interstate highway. And so these just where are these different charging stations, number of charging stations. And this is just for one of the many scenarios. And you can see that there's a lot along Interstate Highway 40. And there's a lot along Interstate Highway 80 and 90. So those were several biggies. So this is just helpful for planning. I would love to do this for Europe. I think you guys are adding a lot of stations. I'm not sure what the algorithm is, but that's wonderful. So if you need our algorithm, just let us know. And you know, the location pattern will evolve as you start investing because you already have maybe a charging station where you didn't expect it. But it's helpful certainly. And California, you know, is a big buyer of electric vehicles, thank goodness. And so they're more important than this algorithm realizes because so many of the battery-only electric vehicles are owned on the West Coast. But we own one. A lot of our neighbors own one. I can't drive in Austin without seeing another Tesla, basically. So if we assume the Tesla stations will permit other people to use their charging stations and you add stations, you go from about 25% long distance trip completion rate to 61%, even with a very short range vehicle. So it's very important, I think, and it would be wonderful if Tesla would open up those stations, even though it may not look optimal for all Americans. You know, they've very much focused on their California market for those station locations. So anyhow, I look forward to your questions. I do have two more parts to this presentation. One is about shared autonomous electric vehicles. So we're combining these two technologies now. To save money on labor, you can have them inductively charged so they don't even have to touch, maybe a robotic arm, so that they come in and nobody has to be there to immediately plug them in or ensure that their battery gets the current it needs. And so we're taking a vehicle that may be a 2-seater or 4-seater that can drive itself, plus is part of a fleet. And so this is a car to go, is a smart car, obviously, chassis. You guys have a lot of these in Europe. And then they inductive charging at a bunch of charging stations. So we had to put charging stations down to serve this fleet. This is the Austin region here. We've also done it now for Chicago and a place called Bloomington, Illinois. And so those papers are at my website if you want to see them. But these were the stations in one scenario versus another scenario. And I bet you can guess which scenario. You don't need many stations if you're going to use a long range vehicle for your fleet. But if you use a short range vehicle, they're going to run out of power and they're going to be stranded. So you're going to need a lot more stations. But this is the left side image is not that useful, because if your Tesla runs out of or comes close to running out of charge, you have to go a long distance to get it charged up and then go back and respond to calls for service. These are like taxis. Okay, so these are fleets of self-driving taxis. And so I recommend this right side image, or this many, as many charging stations as you can get, so that your fleet is able to quickly get charged and get back out and serve those passengers who are calling for a ride, because they don't want to own a vehicle or they don't want to drive themselves. So this is what we're hoping for the future, is very small, efficient, hopefully all electric vehicles. And if they are all electric, that we're going to have these range limitations that are going to mean that they need to fill up in the middle of the day. They can't go all day, especially that 60 mile. This vehicle would be filling up, 3 times a day actually to serve the demand if the mode choice for this kind of fleet situation goes up high. This is what it looks like in downtown Austin. I'm right here today. I'm right at the University of Texas at Austin. Here's our Capitol building. Here's where our high rises are. And so these stations are kind of just randomly placed, these blue stations. This is when we needed, a lot of them, but it's not bad to put this many down, even if you have a longer range fleet. Just make them smaller and make them simpler. You're probably going to need some human beings working at some of these stations, however, to maintain the vehicles, to check their sensors and to make sure they stay clean. Nobody left any gum in them, and maybe wash them every so often before sending them back on the road to pick up other passengers. And so we compared a fleet of hybrid shared autonomous vehicles. So this did not need to plug in. This just needed to refuel about once a day, because it had a very high range, 500 miles. That's what my Prius has. And then we had a short range fleet and a long range all electric fleet. And we had slow charging, where it takes 240 minutes, so 4 hours to charge versus 30 minutes. And if you have the hybrids, it takes just a couple minutes actually to fill them once they park at the station. So you barely need any gas stations to fill them, but you do need a lot to take care of these short range vehicles. And we went ahead and stayed with 155 across this 2 million person 6-county region to keep it fair between the electric vehicle fleets that we were simulating. We kept the sizes the same too, to keep it fair, except we also had one more scenario where we cheaped out. We did not have as many vehicles serving these passengers who were calling for taxis on a typical travel day. So it was a weekday. The hybrid fleet was able to serve a lot of trips. I think they served almost 30 trips a day, so 28.5 a day per vehicle, traveling, over 450 miles a distance, and not being able to serve a few people. Okay, so almost 2% of trips it took so long for the vehicle to get to them that they would have given up. They wouldn't have taken the vehicle on that particular trip. So we gave them the ride free or something, but almost 2%, it was a 30-minute wait time, and that was just way too long. The average wait time was just 4.5 minutes, okay? Especially downtown, the wait times are like 2 minutes or less. And some of the travel was, of course, unoccupied, empty vehicle miles traveled, because the car was going from one drop off of a person to a pickup of the next person. Those numbers varied a fair bit as you go across these different types of electric vehicles, or you have a smaller fleet. And you see, really, of all these, this is the best option you have. It is the most competitive. It has to turn away maybe 3% of users almost, but it serves about the same number of trips with almost the same wait time. These vehicles, these are like a Tesla. Okay, they're traveling almost as many miles. They do have to fill up midday, because this is a 200-mile range vehicle and it's traveling 441 miles. So it's going to fill up a couple times probably, or charge a couple times depending on the vehicle. Some are used less than this. And And so, yeah, we really preferred like that. The hybrid did great. Okay. The Prius did great, but the Tesla also did very well. So if you're going to go with an all electric shared autonomous vehicle fleet, you're going to want to go with a longer range and a faster charge time. And the fleet size is also important in terms of lowering those wait times for the passengers. So yeah, we just can't recommend for like a region like Austin. If you only want to serve a downtown, you know, downtown Bari or downtown Rome or something, you can go with a smaller battery. And but you do want the fast charging times, and you do as you allow for more and more region to be served by these fleets, you're going to need a larger battery. Finally, we're doing a whole multiple regions. So we're bringing together Houston, San Antonio, Austin, Dallas, Fort Worth. So lots of people in this mega region, maybe 20 million people, let's say. And we're going to be looking at freight and passenger travel together in this triangle. Okay, but we're going to actually simulate the whole state of Texas. Lots of flows you can see here, very complicated, big state. Bigger than in most European countries, I think, in terms of physical size. It has a population of about 25 million, I think, 22 million. And here's that triangle with all these big cities and a lot of connectivity. So it's called a mega region. And so we added self-driving vehicles there. We assumed here it wasn't really the marginal cost of the trip. It was the real cost of the trip in a human-driven vehicle versus an autonomous vehicle. So a 1/3 price increase as you go from a human-driven to an autonomous vehicle, or you can order a self-driving, a shared autonomous vehicle, excuse me, at $1 per mile. So that's half the price of Uber and Lyft, but it's more than taking a bus. But of course, it comes to you, and it's door-to-door service, so it's very attractive for most people. For shorter trips, maybe not for the longer trips where it can get kind of expensive. And so when we simulated this region, we saw that automobile shares, because of the autonomous vehicles, started to rise for some short because of this SAV trip, this SAV option, and the long distance because of this. It's going to have a lower value of time. So it may cost more per mile to own that vehicle or to maintain it, or to rent it, but it's going to allow you to do something else rather than drive it. So the passengers may not feel very differently, but the driver, him or herself, is going to be really happy to have the car take over, and we expect. Right now, people are very nervous about autonomous vehicles, of course, but in the long term, you know, once they see, you know, people safely arriving and departing all the time, they're probably going to get sucked into it, just like buying a cell phone kind of. They didn't think they needed one, but then they realize it's an awesome opportunity. Bus and rail, of course, fall. So you're seeing the automobile difference in trips per day before versus after. And then if we look at it here, we see the air market fall dramatically. So this is a zero level on the air trips per day on this second y-axis, but most of these cities, we're only modeling like 4 big cities, so maybe 6 big airports, and those distances are right in here. And of course, these are not long distances. These are maybe 400 miles or less. I guess 150 miles is the sweet spot on those city distances. So a lot of airplane flights right now for people between those cities, but we're going to lose a lot of market share. So big reductions in trips per day there on the airlines. Here, this is just short distance trips. These are up to 50 miles, whereas here, the second graph is for the 50 and over. But there's nothing longer than 400 miles or even 300 miles in this mega region. So you can kind of ignore everything to the right of that distance. We're seeing, you know, maybe not so much impact on some of the mid to shorter distances. And then the air trips, you know, just don't exist for anything less than 50 miles. But within that region, we do see a big dramatic reduction in those air trips. And so all of this is in the paper at our website. You know, it's pretty complicated stuff. It's a lot of assumptions and a lot of results. But, you know, big reductions in bus and air for these short distance trips and the longer distance trips. Air doesn't exist in the short distance markets, but it's an 80% reduction in this region. So almost a complete loss of those flights. You wouldn't expect service anymore by airline in this region, except, you know, congestion can get really bad. And so we have congestion feeding back in this particular model. All these trips, since it's a mega region, all these trips can take place within one day. And so you can sense the congestion over a 24-hour period, and you can simulate it. And that's what Yan Tao did to write this paper. Vehicle miles traveled rising quite a lot for the automobile. And I guess these are, this is vehicle miles, which is interesting because rail can hold a lot of people, but there's very little market share for rail and even bus. And of course, air is very expensive. So relatively small market shares for these guys. So, but you know, airline is a big industry. And so to see it lose so much demand in a big state like Texas is very scary for those airlines, especially like a Southwest airline or somebody who often serves those short markets. We do see a lot more miles by autonomous vehicles on the ground. So this is before we had the autonomous vehicles, and after we're seeing vehicle miles traveled both by conventional automobiles and self-driving vehicles, you know, like a 50% increase. Austin, 57% increase. We are considered a high-tech area, and Tesla just moved one of its fabrication plants. So they're building that right now. I think they're kind of upset with California for quarantining their workers for so long. So they've come to Texas for a more, I guess, work-friendly environment. So, but this doesn't take that into account. But yeah, autonomous vehicles will be big here in Austin, I think, and Houston, and across the mega region. So lots of added traffic, making for a lot more red area. You can see before and after the autonomous vehicles. This is the Houston area. You're seeing a lot more of those links having volume to capacity ratios above 1. So that means that demand exceeds capacity of the roadways, each of those links. And so these were 5% of the region's links before, and now it's 10%. So a doubling of those basically gridlocked roads. I mean, they're spilling back. So there's a queue forming because demand is exceeding supply. And you see that up here in the Dallas-Fort Worth region and along this corridor. So this is an interstate highway here. It's called Interstate Highway 35. It goes from Mexico all the way up to Canada. And you can see that trail of red lights along that corridor. So average travel distance rising. We're looking at both short trips and long trips in this model. We're looking at trucking and passenger, but for passenger, about a 14 to 16 mile distance increase. Air travel falling dramatically, but it's not, you know, this mega region is not a big part of those airports. So the Dallas-Fort Worth Airport serves trips from all over the place. And so a lot of that travel will stay there. I mean, maybe they'll lose 50% rather than 80%. But in terms of the local flights, we're expecting very big reductions there. And big increases in vehicle miles traveled on existing highways, but hopefully at tighter headways, right? So at some point, the government's going to have to mandate that self-driving vehicles follow at, I don't know, half-second or 1 second headways probably, because half-second is going to be really scary for you and me being inside that vehicle. But I think we can handle 1 second headways. And so that's better than the kind of the 1.6 second headway between vehicles that we currently have on our highways. Not going to work on the local roads. And of course, not going to work so well with the human-driven vehicles that will still be out there. So at some point, they're going to have to mandate this technology, not for congestion, but for safety. So if you really want a vision zero of no deaths and hopefully no severe injuries someday, you really are going to have to mandate, I think, automation of the vehicles so that you and I, you know, don't get distracted. Even though the vehicle's not perfect, it's a heck of a lot better. So it'll probably reduce crashes by, you know, 50% early on and maybe 80% long term. We have a paper on that too, if you're interested. It's not very regional science oriented, but you know, it might be of interest to you. And then we saw freight movements in this particular region. So when we modeled the nation, we saw more of those commodity classes getting a boost, but for this particular region, about half of them had a notable boost. So it was a lot of information to take in. Hopefully you guys have lots of questions and comments and suggestions for us. This was 5 different papers, but there's over 30 at my website in case you want to take a look at those. I really appreciate your attention.
Thank you, Cara. It was a lot of information, a lot of food for thought. So while I'm actually waiting for other people to ask questions, I know it's always kind of difficult to be the one that breaks the ice. So I will do that, and I'll wait for other people to summon their courage to ask you something. Right. So really a lot of food for thought. And so I kept on writing down different questions or that range from more technical ones to kind of more curiosity ones. First of all, let me tell you one thing that made me laugh, but I have to tell you. You mentioned that the cost of kids staying in a car, it's less than $12 per hour because they don't work. Actually, I think that my son, the cost of staying in a car for an hour, it's infinity, because I think it's like 1,000. So opportunity cost might also be linked to other reasons other than having a job. And my mental sanity cost, it's also very high when I travel with kids in a car. So when you mention kids, probably you have the wrong example. Okay, joking aside. So another thing I have to mention is that I spent all my PhD using discrete choice models. I also went to the talk that Dan McFadden and Heckman did the year that they won the Nobel Prize. So I'm extremely envious of the fact that you got to work with Dan McFadden. And on these, yes, kids have almost no money. That's true, but I'm paying for it, for their cost. They have my son has my money. Right. Okay. So can you go back? I know it's a lot of slides ago, but can you go back to your nested logit model? Because this,
for the freight model,
for the very first one. The one in which you had autonomous trucks versus human trucks as the last level of the nested logit. Sure. I'm going to ask you, since you work with Dan McFadden, right? And since the nested logit was in my nightmares at the end of the PhD for a very long time. Okay, so you use a nested logit model because basically, if you were to use like a multinomial logit model, the independence of irrelevant alternatives assumption will be violated because, of course, the A track and the H track are more substitutable, right, between them. Then is that correct? Is that okay? Okay, so I got that one. You mentioned one thing, and I didn't know whether I understood it correctly or not. Is this a standard nested logit model with the usual variance covariance matrix, or is it modified in certain ways so that you were doing something more advanced that I didn't catch?
No, it's standard. So there's two inclusive value coefficients.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so for well, you can actually say it maybe for the others.
Yeah, so the utilities can have a different scale at this level of the tree than the utilities, the random utilities at this level and the random utilities at this level. And so we expect the highest correlation right in here for a given origin, if they've gone down the truck mode, then which kind of truck is it going to be? But yeah, there's an inclusive value coefficient here and one here. And I don't know the values off the top of my head. They differed by industry.
Okay. Okay, so that's clear. So it's a standard nested logit model, and I get that. So when I was using this model in my PhD, my nightmare was that it was very difficult for me to get them to converge. And I guess most of the reason was that it was very difficult to find variables that were identifying the last level of the nested logit model compared to the one before. So in other words, I had a similar problem, although it was not a transportation problem. But say you take individual characteristics of people or whatever explanatory variable you are getting, right? How do you define the variables that make you choose between A track versus H track as compared to the one they make you choose between rail and track? Because for me, they were basically the same. So I always got this problem of, what kind of set of covariates do I use in each level?
Okay, so if we really did have data on people choosing H truck versus A
Yeah.
truck, which we don't have because these things don't really exist yet. So we only had this structure and we had to add this nest. So we had to make up this inclusive value parameter
Okay.
and the alternative specific constants in here. We also brought down the beta parameter on travel time for the autonomous trucks. So the disutility of another hour of autonomous truck time was less, but we unfortunately it was a more expensive, so the variable on cost went up, but its parameters stayed the same. So we had to make good assumptions to bring this nest into it. But let's talk about this. So here you've got time and cost is per mile. So there might be a fixed cost, especially for the longer trips where there's going to be an overnight stay for that driver, or you're going to have to find a new driver and bring him or her onto the vehicle. That's kind of an expensive transfer to make. So depending on the distance of the trip, you might have a bump on cost because of that extended trip. But yeah, we have time and distance basically, and time is very, very much a function of distance, but it does depend on speed, and it does depend on where you're picking up and dropping off, because those are fixed costs. The pickup and the drop off durations are fixed costs. So you've got time and, let's say, distance as variables in here. And you've also got a very important alternative specific constant. So a lot of people prefer truck because it's more reliable. It can go door to door. You can find out where your item is. That's a little bit harder on rail lines. And
Yep.
so there's an automatic positive alternative specific constant on the truck relative to the rail alternative. And then, up here, these are mostly affected by the variables that are down here. You don't even have to have another variable in here. The choice of your origin is going to very much depend on what is the relative utility of its modes. And the farther away that origin is, the more expensive this part of the nest is going to be. And that's going to plug right in here. So you don't need, alternative specific constants. It'd be way too many. You'd have like 250 or 300, however many zones we had. I guess we had 3,000 counties. So, potentially there's no way we could have estimated it, and there's no way we would have wanted it. But you can control for population or jobs in each of those counties to kind of reflect the existing land use patterns. And we may have done that because we were trying to mimic the freight analysis framework data. So I think we probably did have the size of those counties, population and jobs maybe, to help us in addition to these costs of these modes. So if they already have big industries there, they're probably more attractive in addition to maybe being closer for these modes.
Okay. And so on these, so you talked about airplanes and air traveling later on, but I was just wondering why, because at some point you come up with these 3,000 miles threshold, right? If you go above 3,000 miles, then you use trains, although I find trains in the US extremely slow, very long and slow compared to Europe. So I was always amazed when they were passing by, because it would take them hours to just pass by. But I understand why, of course. Okay, so why in this specific model, you are looking at truck versus rail, but you never mention or you never consider in this model airplanes? Because my idea...
This is freight.
Okay.
So not a lot of freight gets moved by air.
Okay, that was because in my mind, actually, I've always associated the US, even for freight, maybe, I don't know, because it shows that I'm not into transportation, but I thought that maybe for long distances you were using the airplanes. I know that we don't do it in Europe very much. Not even for passengers, probably as much as you do. You do use airplanes for passengers, also for shorter distances, as you showed even. So even in the US, this is a very small, say, percentage that gets moved by airplanes, right?
Well, parcels get moved by airplanes. So high value shipments, so certain industries, so maybe not a computer, but a lot of small stuff does get moved. And you'll see like Amazon has its own aircraft. They don't pay to move things, but the US Postal Service moves it in existing bellies of airplanes, mostly that are moving passengers. And so, yeah, you do see it's not a lot of heavyweight stuff. And I'm trying. I don't know. I think it was less than 5%. Certainly, of the ton miles, it's probably less than
Okay.
1%. So, and those slow trains you're noticing, those are freight trains. So Europe is very different. It uses its rail lines for passengers, whereas we use our rail lines for freight. And so that's part of why it's not a high value of time good that's
Yeah,
moving
yeah.
on the rail. And so that's part of why they don't spend a lot of fuel and they don't have really nice tracks to make those trains go faster when you see them. But I assume you've been on like the Acela line or something between Philadelphia and DC maybe, and its top speed is maybe 200 miles per hour, but
Yeah, 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 yeah.
the
Yeah,
stations
yeah, no,
really
no,
slow you down.
I know it was trains that were shipping, goods and that they were not very high value, but boys, they're very long. I mean, I understand that, but they're so long that it's almost unbelievable, at least from a European perspective.
Yeah, they're
Um,
200 cars long. So these are freight trains and they have a lot of cars, for sure.
Um, one last question, and then I see that there are some people in the chat, and then I might come back with some of other curiosity later on. Um, are there specific limitations to the A tracks compared to the H tracks? Okay, so you mentioned that, of course, with trucks you go door to door, right? And with the rail, of course, you don't. But do they do exactly the same services, the A track and the H track?
Yeah, except that, the H truck usually has to stop for several hours after
Mhm.
driving for 8 hours because of those hours of service limitations. So the A truck can keep moving because its driver can sleep and that kind of thing en
But they
route.
don't have issues like, I don't know, because I know nothing about this, but they don't have issues like, I don't know, uh, driving in very narrow streets or something like that, something that you would associate, a human being to be needed for. They do the same exact job.
Well, we expect there to be an operator on board, and so there may still be controls for the
Okay.
operator to use, like if something goes wrong with the sensors or something. So that operator will probably be qualified to still drive it, and but can on those long, boring stretches, the operator would be, he would not be watching the
Mhm.
road. But in the pickup and drop off stage, when they're in urban traffic, they probably will be watching the road and just making sure that nothing goes wrong. So they're kind of a backup to the computer.
Sorry, but one last thought I had was actually on the skills of the people that are needed for an H track versus the A track. This was my first question, actually, because, I'm very much into human capital. And I was thinking, well, you assume that because you said, well, they can sleep, but they can also do some other kind of work for their firm. And I thought about things like, secretarial jobs or whatever, using an Excel spreadsheet to do some kind of reporting on, I don't know, whatever. But are we sure that are the same people? Or in other words, I'm thinking maybe for an A track, you don't need a simple driver, but you need somebody with slightly higher skills, and then you pay that person more. So you save on the track, but well, and you can say, okay, but you don't have a person, a secretary in the office anymore. There is a
Right.
substitution effect. I get that.
Yeah.
But will it be the case that in the future, we are basically saying that even in the truck industry, people with very low human capital are going to be unemployable because you have to do a little bit more?
Yeah, I think it depends. I mean, they may need extra hands at the pickup and drop off points. There may be different styles. So it depends what the route is. So you're seeing like different industries prefer the A trucks because they've got the longer route shipments and or the less complicated travel patterns and driving settings. And so and the A trucks, it's expensive to add
Mhm.
that automation. So
Yeah.
it might be the bigger trucks, whereas the smaller local delivery trucks, are still they're not gonna spend that extra money to get that automation added. So yeah, it really depends on what's on board and what the trip
Yeah.
distance is and where you're picking up and dropping off, these kinds of things, I
But
think.
I
So
think
I
it's
can't
interesting to think whether this artificial intelligence in this particular context will mean an upskill or a downskill or same skills for the people that are actually operating this. Because it might go one way, it might go the other. I actually thought that maybe the people with lower skill might be disadvantaged if we go into this
I think they will be disadvantaged in many ways, but it could be simpler. So it really depends on the market that it's serving. So there's a lot of different markets.
Anyway, we do have a question from Alessandro Crociata. Alessandro, you can talk?
Well, I see the question. He's wondering if I've included other things besides these utilitarian attributes of just distance, and let's see, distance and maybe this big assumption on value of time. So absolutely, we've done a lot of surveys of passenger travelers, so person travelers rather than freight. It's hard to get data on freight. So you are kind of stuck with these simplistic models for freight. You can have it vary by industry, but it really, those industries are very complicated and there's a lot of special attributes within each industry that we're not controlling for here. But when we do models of person level behavior, we have more attributes to look at if we want. And so for like that last paper I talked about, the mega region travel, you can have the age and the gender and the educational level and the income and the household size and whether there's children in the household. You can have the kind of neighborhood that they live in. We regularly control for all those things when we do those kinds of models. And so in addition to time and cost, but the value of time can vary quite a bit. And you could have, more heterogeneity there. It just doesn't help so much when you are simulating millions of people because a lot of those variations are going to cancel one another. So it's not necessary to control for, whether that person drove a lot as a kid or didn't drive a lot as a kid. So you're just kind of using the average air term for what the US data set, I think, that we used for some of those assumptions. And yeah, I think also one of the issues you get into when you're trying to control for like habits or culture, I mean, the culture I think is already embedded because the data set is coming from the same region, but very particular idiosyncrasies are tricky because you can't predict those in the future. And we're trying to predict for the future. And so I don't know how habit or culture is going to evolve for each one of these people. And I wouldn't want to try to predict it. We can normally predict age and gender and location of people in the future and maybe education and household size. But trying to say that that's going to be an input I have to predict the future on an individual's particular habits, I'd rather not. I'd rather let the air term pick that up to reflect the heterogeneity. And so there's a fair amount of noise in these models. It's tough to predict what a person's going to do on one day or on a survey where we have stated preferences because these modes do not exist yet. And yeah, it'll be interesting as children age, they're very good with phones. They're better than their parents at figuring out phones and other technologies. So it'll be interesting to see this kind of cross-sectionally estimated set of parameters, how relevant it will be for 20, 30 years from now. There could be so many things that change in addition to the global economy and democracy. Hopefully we'll still have a democratically elected president here and other policymakers. Hopefully we'll be a lot wiser in 30 years. But did you want to unmute yourself and ask more directly?
He's shy. Alessandro, do you want to ask, is it clear? Do you want to ask something else?
Okay, and Sandro, you have some questions?
Yes, Sandro.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So first of all, thank you very much for this presentation. Indeed, well, a lot of data and information, and what hearing from you, I inevitably was tempted to reconnect all these things to other more specific interests of mine. Sorry for that. So the question that I have might be, I think Alessandro, shut down your mic. Can you hear me? Hello.
Hi.
Hi. Are you?
Yes, we can. I muted Alessandro.
All right. So I was saying that maybe my question, I'm not say strictly related to the kind of data or info you provided, but sort of implications or background questions. So sorry for that. Third question that I have has to do with the fact that the vehicles about which you talk to me are eco-innovations, right? So they are very important eco-innovations, and eco-innovations in general, these one too, are mainly driven by environmental regulations. So the first question that I have, also in thinking about the extent to which the picture that you presented could extend to Europe, how important environmental regulations have been or still are in framing the kind of picture that you have reconstructed or simulated. And in particular, I'm wondering whether in the simulation, environmental regulations are assumed to be constant, time invariant, or possibly becoming more stringent, less stringent, or something like that. And this is the first question that I have.
Okay, can I start with that one so I don't forget it?
Yeah.
Okay, so we don't assume anything about requirements in the papers I showed you, but in some of my other papers, we'll simulate, like, the cost of technology is falling, because we'll simulate a fleet evolution at the level of households across the nation. We'll simulate their own household fleet evolution. They own 1 or 2 cars oftentimes. And so cars are long-lived assets. And so we do that, and we sometimes add, requirements like only electric vehicles can be sold, or only autonomous vehicles can be sold. You can't have like a dual mode vehicle where you could put it in autonomous mode or drive it, and because of the safety effects. So we do that to see at what point, we have 100% autonomous vehicles, or how long it takes to get to 90% autonomous vehicles. So we do that sometimes, but normally we don't play around with the policy on the papers that I showed you.
Okay. Right. So second question that I have has to do with the role of, let me call it, super players like Tesla, right? So I mean, it has appeared how pivotal, how important players like Tesla are for the evolution of the picture that you presented. So the kind of question that I have, again, sorry, maybe not strictly related to what you presented, is which kind of industrial policies you think could be devised to make companies like Tesla socially cooperating, cooperating in the diffusion of this kind of modes of transports? This is the second question that I have.
Yeah, well, Tesla's been fantastic, quite honestly. I mean, I know that Elon was very upset when California wouldn't let them go back to the fabrication plant near the San Jose area. And I could totally understand that frustration, because I was very worried about businesses, and especially low income workers, or a fantastic business like Tesla, which has really motivated all the auto manufacturers to say, well, obviously this can be done. And, why aren't we doing it? It's embarrassing that they can't rival that with all the decades of experience that they have. So he's been a fantastic leader. All of his businesses, I think, have been motivated by, what's kind of important socially. So he has a Solar City. He has the Boring Company, which is for tunneling, because he hates congestion, and he, and of course he has SpaceX, and a lot of this he just made that money, his PayPal money, he parlayed it. He didn't sit contentedly with wealth, and that's been really important, more important than the regulations that we're very slow to adopt here in this capitalist society of mine. And Europe's been very good. Of course, you guys went whole hog into diesel, and we didn't realize how bad diesel was. Diesel's very deadly. And so we're trying to electrify our buses. We don't have, and of course, our heavy duty trucks. So now Elon and Tesla are trying to make trucks and show how the torque is amazing on these vehicles. And auto manufacturers said for decades, there's no way you can build an all electric truck. You just can't do it. And they're demonstrating it. So that demonstration is super important. Same thing on autonomy. They're scaring all the other auto manufacturers to death because they've had this little autopilot, and they have, more and more, they update their software over the house Wi-Fi, and you have a new car the next day. I mean, other auto manufacturers are definitely being motivated much more by that than the slow regulations we have in this country.
Right. And the very last question is a question. I mean, I'm admittedly ignorant about that, and I would like to know more about that. You use and you refer in the initial part of your talk to regional input-output tables, right? And I'm wondering, I'm ignorant of that, so sorry for the question. So do you have in the US real regional input-output tables that actually, have been up with actual regional intra-industry data at the state level, or are they derivations from national input-output tables? Because we have problems like that in Europe, in our countries, and I wonder whether in the US the state input-output tables is better.
I think we're calling the same table. So I think we're using one set of those A values, AMNs, I guess, from industry M to industry N, just because we didn't particularly care that much about the sub-regional idiosyncrasies. This is not for use, by a city to compare to their actual numbers. So we really want to see what's the percentage change in traffic if we do this. So we're more interested in percentages rather than absolute magnitude. So I think we used a single national set of technical coefficients, but we had, regional purchase coefficients that help distinguish because it can be pretty important whether you're near a border or you're not near a border. Is there anything else on that question?
No, I'm fine. Thank you, Cara. Thank you. I'm sorry for all these questions. Yeah.
Any more questions from anybody? No? Can I just ask you one last, this is just a curiosity. So this is about your last paper. And I'm telling you the background of why I'm asking you this question. So I just recently changed my car and I consider buying an electric. And then one of the issues was, well, I can't really drive from Milan to L'Aquila, which is 600 kilometers. And I don't know where the charging stations are, which I think is pretty common. I think that the US are more advanced in this. They're better than Europe, at least better than Italy in terms of charging station. And I know that you are just trying to understand, the trade-off between having a battery that is larger and the number of charging stations. And you didn't talk about the cost of charging stations and so on. But I was just wondering, since I'm a regional economist, in the US, these charging stations are co-located with normal, gas stations, or they are in different places. Okay, so dedicated places, right?
Yeah, so a lot of gas stations are suddenly thinking, maybe we should have a charging station here too, but very few gas stations actually have that right now. So these are separate things, often a public-private partnership. So they're getting power at a lower cost than maybe the private market participants around them would, because the community is trying to incentivize the addition of a charging area. But they're
because it has to do more with the grid rather than, that's why they're not co-located.
I don't know if it's greed. It's just that the public wants them, but the private market is skittish. So the private market is a little nervous. And so they're not positive yet because it's a long duration that the vehicle stays there. So what's more important than having cheap gasoline, let's say, is being co-located with a restaurant or a park or something so that you can spend 30 minutes doing something interesting. Although Tesla has games on board, and I think BMW may have games on board now for charging, and we have karaoke. And so Tesla tries to make it interesting inside your vehicle, but you could have hair cutting salons, you could have all sorts of little things that you may need to do anyway while your car is being charged. And so that's what they're aiming for normally.
Then there is even, I thought there was a problem in Europe, and now that you are telling me that not only they have dedicated spots, but they also need to be co-located with all these facilities, I'm thinking, is it really feasible for Europe? Because in the US, you have a lot of land availability. but in Europe, we don't. How do we solve that problem? You were thinking about, I don't know, 200 stations, right? And I'm thinking, well, we don't probably have 200 spots near, I don't know, Milan, so that we can have
Well,
a
200 stations across the nation.
No, I know.
Big.
But
Yes.
even so, do you really think that, because obviously the US is much more ahead of the curve than Europe, but can it be that for Europe, it's also a problem of land availability for the charging stations? It's much more expensive for us, isn't it?
Just use a parking space that already exists on a curb. But you do have to build the conduit. So that's the expensive thing, is and tapping a higher voltage than your standard voltage. Now, your standard voltage is great. It cost me like $400 to create that kind of voltage in my garage, because our standard voltage is half of Europe. Yeah. But that's level 2 charging. I know. You really need level 3. So you're going to, it's easiest to do it in the downtown because they already have a lot of high voltage, because those businesses are all drawing higher voltage for, I don't know, washers and dryers and special things that, businesses, industry will often have. So you've got higher voltage penetrating your cities. You've got them along a lot of your major highways. So it's not that hard. All you need is a piece of pavement, really, but then the conduit. So you have to build the conduit, and that's part of the expense. But you don't need much space. I mean, you have all these cars. If you have a car, you have a place to put it. So you have a place to charge. You do. Well,
I'm glad that you are. I know nothing about these, and I often wonder if that could have been part of the problem, of the reason why we don't have really charging stations. We don't have very many.
I think you do. I think you need an app. Yeah, just go Google online, where are the charging stations in Italy? And also there are phone apps that will tell you, and my Tesla will tell me. So if I want to go to New York today, I'll just type in my destination and it'll say, okay, you probably need to charge here, here, and here along the way. So that.
But that's in the US. In Europe as well, you reckon? Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, then because I can see this is, I was really determined to get an electric when I got my car, and then I got discouraged even by the people that were selling the cars.
Oh yeah, the salespeople are not great. They don't know the technology very well. They worry that you won't have much maintenance on it because you won't have oil changes and all this kind of stuff. So they're not very good about that, I'm afraid. But if you go to a Tesla store, those guys are good. That's their product.
Yeah, no, well, sure, I know. But because, the information that they give you is all very negative in terms of, charging stations, or the battery that it's very heavy and then you consume more gas if you decide to go for a hybrid. I mean, I changed different places and I really got discouraged I'm sorry to say, but I did.
It is the future. I mean, we shouldn't be buying new conventional vehicles. We should only be buying hybrids or plug-ins. But it is expensive to have a plug-in hybrid. That's an expensive technology. So, and then the range won't be very long on the all-electric portion of it. So you probably just want to go for a battery-only vehicle. And yeah, you're going to save a lot of money. We have papers at my website where we look at your annual costs for fuel. And I mean, in Europe, oh my gosh, you guys are great. You're in the green already. Here, it's a little dicey, right? You spend a lot more up front, but you save a lot over the ownership. And so in Europe, it's an easy win usually for the battery-only electric vehicle.
Oh, great. Well, that is, I think, if nobody else has any question, I think this is a very good point to end our conversation, because we are ending with a positive note. So any more questions before I actually thank Cara for one last time? No? Well, it was very interesting. You really gave us so much information. You can think about your talk probably for the next month or so. It was great and very interesting topics, I should say, because you showed us so much on different papers. And I just want to thank you very much. I know you are very busy, and so it's an honor for us to have had the opportunity to listen to you and to hear you talk in our seminars. Thank you very much, Cara.
Grazie, è un piacere. And I I hope you guys will join us for the regional science conferences here in North America in November. It's very inexpensive this year because it's on Zoom. So it's like $50. And
we will. I can tell you that a bunch of us are already registered. You can ask Neil Reed. So we will be seeing you at the NARS conference online.
Excellent. Thanks, you guys.
Thank you very much. Bye, Cara. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure.